Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. Today, I have Andy Micah with me. Hello, Andy. Hope you're
Hello.
doing well on this rainy September. Uh, and we have only a small number of topics, but they're pretty big ones this week, including the Unite the Kingdom March, Starmer's bad month in political terms, Trump's visit, which has already gotten off to a flying start, and the London Anarchist Bookfair, which is coming up on Saturday. So, starting with Unite the Kingdom, obviously the biggest march for the far right in certainly this generation, I think it's fair to say, and possibly ever. Um, I'm sure Andy will have some historical tidbits related to that. But yeah, they've obviously been crowing a great deal about it. It's a very interesting phenomenon in as much as, from our perspective, charging around doing A to B marches with big speeches, we've done bigger as the left, the broad left, and they very rarely make a huge difference. But on the other hand, usually the government is not keen to listen to us, whereas I think the same is not true of Starmer in this case. But Andy, what do you think about the whole phenomenon? Um,
Oh, blimey, right. First of all, numbers. Um, now, we see the usual variety from the cops saying 110,000. Now, normally you take the top cop figure and start increasing it, and you take the organisers' figures and start decreasing it. In this more advanced stage, you can actually take some mapping websites and start putting crowd densities on the areas that you've Googled and stuff. And
Swish.
the the sad thing is, I don't find 110,000 implausible. I think that's if you gave it a standard deviation for our maths geeks of something in the region of 20,000, I think that you'd probably be within that. Um, um, that doesn't mean that all of them, of course, are the little group of right-wing thugs that actually started to kick things off. It is it is far broader phenomenon than that, and the very fact that Tommy was fronting it does not imply by any means that those people are mobilizable by Tommy to do stuff other than show patriotism. So I'm not as depressed as I would have been if I'd actually been there in person and scared shitless when the Nazis were coming for me, which is always an unpleasant experience. But it it is worrying because they have never been able to put that numbers out in I just can't think of a historical example of something that is right wing in this country that has done that. If you go back to the British Union of Fascists in the 30s, they just didn't have those sort of numbers. It just hasn't occurred here. But you are entirely right that large numbers do not policy make. The Million Muppet March of 2003.
That was a Muppet.
Um, well, to be fair, I trust you were not one of the 8 people arrested on that day, um, of whom I personally knew 5, including the great Ketamine Joe, who led the one-man charge on the American embassy. Um, the I will not mention the name of the unhelpful comrade who, as he was caught by the TSG, which was lucky because before the armed police shot him, and if he'd beaten them, the Marines would have shot him. So he was actually going to be okay until a certain person shouted out, "Joe, you've forgotten the Semtex again," uh, which led to a rather rapid strip search. But I digress. This one, although it's got a lot of media attention for the small group of The arrests are count is low. I think it's 26. They put up another 11 wanted pictures. It is not a mass display of right wing thug power that can wipe people off the streets. That's simply not there. What it is, in my view, is a huge number of people who are disgruntled with conventional politics. And that is being focused far more efficiently by the far right than by the left at the moment. And that is worrying, but it's not quite as worrying as it seems on first sight.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's sort of Clive Lewis at one point put out a bit talking about a friend of his who went to um, the march, saying that said friend hadn't really clocked it as a far right march, but thought of it more as a um, sort of a chance to be patriotic and all the rest of it. I I struggle to reconcile that entirely with the tone of the speakers or the types of speakers they were getting on. It's difficult to say Elon Musk and Zamora and Tommy Robinson represent anything other than a deeply unpleasant strain of far right politics. Um, it's possible that a bunch of people showed up and then had to listen to a bunch of far right politics, whether some of them took that on board and have moved rightward since is difficult to say. It's possible. Whether other ones were thoroughly put off by the whole experience, also difficult to say. These are huge numbers of people, and getting a demographic breakdown would be a job for YouGov rather than our estimations, I would think. But certainly, it's uh, for the far right a remarkable achievement, both in terms of the sheer number of people prepared to come out, but also worth bearing in mind the logistics of it. The fact that they were able to get all of this stuff sorted out, very expensive, getting people, moving people around in those numbers, getting hold of the big stage and the doing all the promo and all the rest of it. The question should probably be raised as to where all that money came from. I would imagine a quiet multimillionaire or two in the background, or even multi-billionaire in the background, providing a bit of cash to grease the wheels of this sort of stuff. I think, with the modern discrepancy between the left and the right, it's always worth bearing that in mind. That these big turnouts, they are, at least in part, not just because the right are, on the up compared to us in terms of public acknowledgement and public into it. Like, there is a certain point at which you can buy interest, and the far right has been doing that to a great degree. Um,
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how much free travel was provided coach wise, because that's the one that really shifts people. It's a free day out in London. I remember being a student and going to the London demos because it was a day out in London. Got to see me folks, so you can go shopping, you can do anything you like. Yeah, if that kind of incentives are there, and it, it's better to look at it as a day out for most of these people than for a political commitment. And you've got to remember, you look at the numbers of people who every Saturday attend sporting events, or it pales into insignificant, the amount of people who actually turn out for demonstrations. Um,
yeah, so I mean, there's a bit of a tendency across some sections of the left who I think are maybe slightly panicking and usually come from a kind of class-centric background, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I think, obviously I'm a class strugglist first and foremost in my politics, but there's a tendency, I think, for the same kind of people who fetishize the flat-capped industrial worker as kind of the avatar of all working classness forevermore, to who also kind of, not in a kind of proactively racist way, but in a kind of knee-jerk, that's the way you conceive it way. Think of the white working class and the working class as kind of one and the same. So they see 100,000 people who are pretty much all white. There were a few black and brown faces in there, but it was a sea of white people for the most part. And say, this is the working class, and we need to listen to the working class, and we need to take the working class seriously when it expresses these concerns. And it's like, well, I don't think I tend to think that just slinging insults, yeah, sure, it's not terribly helpful. It's more cathartic for us than it is persuasive to anyone else. But it's also important to bear in mind that, yeah, 100,000 people is what, 0.02% of the working class or whatever, right? Like it's a tiny, tiny figure in comparison to the actual breadth and depth of working class people. And it is a very specific demographic within that working class, which excludes every other demographic. So when talking about kind of we need to engage with the class, there is, okay, this is kind of saying we need to engage with slightly panicked white people who may or may not have a racist background to that concern, but who certainly aren't representative of everyone. And to treat it like that. And I think that it would be the wrong way of going about it to say, well, we should be treating this as just a fully acceptable viewpoint that we should be respectful towards, because the organisers and key personnel are absolutely not like representative of the working class. They are well organised, full-on politicos, usually from actually quite middle-class backgrounds. Tommy Robinson and co have a fair bit of money behind them. Elon Musk is absolutely the single least, like physically couldn't be less working class if he tried. So yeah, so like there's a line to be drawn between, yeah, this is a lot of people, but also it's not a case of, oh, we need to throw out our critiques and start, cringing and cap doffing and pretending that we are something that we're not in terms of our viewpoints. Mostly people see through that stuff immediately anyway. Like when we bang on about, if we start talking about, oh, there's better forms of patriotism, 5 minutes after saying you're an anarchist, people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Are you betraying your anarchism, or are you just like trying to manipulate me? Like it's not. It's a bit of a. It's a bad investment in rhetoric, I suppose.
Yeah, and the history of the left, and in particular in regard to racism, is that it was won into such a position that everyone who's gone on any of these marches or the hotel marches goes around saying, I'm not a racist, but whereas 50 years ago, you could have gone out into the street and found a large proportion of the population happy to say that they were racist. And that argument has been won by people taking the initiative and saying what was right. And it is very, very difficult to actually argue in favour that people should be treated differently because of the colour of their skin or where they are born. It's just a obvious unfairness. People tend to go along with some stuff when it is simply tradition, like having a king, who we'll come on to in a moment. But there is, if you like, the traditional British fairness. If you want to play that patriotism card, I always take the difference between patriotism and nationalism from Passport to Pimlico, if you've ever seen the film, where the inhabitants of Pimlico are informed that they are Burgundians and have their water and electricity cut off by the British government. And one of the said Burgundians said, they can't do this to us, we're British. And when told, well, you're Burgundians, the little old lady comes out the window and says, nonsense. We're British. We've always been British. And we always will be British. And it's because we're British that we're standing up for our right to be Burgundians. And if you like, there is that that patriotism about the values that your country espouses, one of which is fairness and decent treatment for refugees, should be something that it's reasonable to expound, because that is no real difference from having community values that anarchism has at its core. It's when you start projecting that your values, that you're better than other people, or you've got some right to treat other people in a bad way, that goes off the rails.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think it'll definitely be it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, comes out of these marches. I mean, I think that there's also a corollary that reform, having been doing so well, and picking up, there's also there's been a graph doing the rounds which has gone a bit hockey stick over the last 3 to 4 years of people adopting more MAGA-esque viewpoints in Britain, and this obviously contributing to the increased vote for reform, which has tended to be the kind of uh, British mirror to MAGA in many ways. Um, but that switch, as you say, it doesn't necessarily. It's difficult to see how far and how deep it goes in terms of it's what loyalty it produces, how motivated in terms of activism the kinds of people who will vote for reform or go to a march might be, and whether this will convert to, for example, significant upticks of attacks on minority groups. I mean, I would not be surprised to see an uptick. In fact, I think it's almost certain to occur. But how sharp that uptick is in comparison to the charted rise or charted change in attitudes is quite difficult to say. I mean, one of the things which I thought was really interesting, I was talking to our Freedom comrade Sam about this the other day, is the way in which these marches are, or which the march and a lot of the rhetoric and behavior um, around this phenomenon has been taking place has been very American. The whole, you have to have your flags everywhere. And at the march itself, people coming up with these enormous wooden crosses. And you're like, and you see people on, who are just not political at all, saying, what on earth are these people doing wandering around with crosses? It's not very British, British attitude, because Britain has become a very, not atheistic necessarily, but religiously uninterested country, I think it's fair to say. Um, and seeing people behaving like Americans is quite jarring in that sense. I think a lot of the response I've been seeing, and this is obviously entirely apocryphal, but a lot of the response I've been seeing has seen people going, why are you behaving like this? This is not very British, actually, the way you're behaving. This whole, oh, if you're not hanging a flag off your what's it, then you're not properly British and all this kind of stuff. And it is, I actually think there's probably a really interesting um, study or analysis to be done, looking at how these phenomena, in their mirroring of Americanism, are actually, ironically, redolent of American cultural imperialism and America's culture steamrolling British culture in the same way that British culture is you know, a unified below monarch and parliament form steamrollers regional culture. Um, and it's obviously the irony being that in a protest against losing your national identity and it being rolled over by, you know, refugees and foreigners, you're manifesting it being rolled over by another imperial power. Um,
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because American cultural imperialism was until recently, if you like, the culture of Hollywood and American TV shows, and and essentially the liberal coastal areas being distributed throughout the world. It's only with the widespread social media that the values of middle America, to be at its politest, are being shipped out, and they have become excessively introspective and right wing, and producing a phenomenon like Trump, and have now got a way to spread beyond America's shores in the way that the lefty dominated cultural exports of America were very much um, progressive, at least in tone, if not in the underlying effect.
Yeah. Okay, so this brings us on nicely, in fact, to our second item of the day, which is Trump's visit. And what a great start we had with Led by Donkeys doing their standard big splashy um, with Trump and Epstein prominently on Windsor Castle's wall. And then four of them got arrested for I mean, initially I think it was suspicion of malicious communication. And now it's been downgraded to some kind of nuisance behaviour, as far as I can work out. But obviously, it's in the great tradition of the British police being told, find a reason to arrest them, get them out of the way until after the foreign dignitary has gone home. But a
So
stark
do you know?
contrast to their treatment of the likes of Musk and Tommy Robinson, obviously.
Do you know if there's a charge yet, or
I don't know. Um,
we'll have a look and let readers know in due course? But yeah, it seems very very shaky legally to me. Uh, um, there might be bylaws against projecting things onto buildings, and you can stretch some stuff, but you ain't going to be able to get public nuisance past the jury.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think everybody's very used to, because Led by Donkeys does this all the time, right? And it's part of a lengthy tradition of, like, I was actually, whilst I was sort of looking up and being like, is this, what sort of arrest is this? This doesn't make much sense. And it reminded me that there was a whole spate, I don't know whether you remember, in the late 90s, around the millennium, of um, firms getting their name in the paper by projecting onto the side of Parliament. Most famously, Gail Porter in her um, birthday suit. Uh, and no, but as I remember it, no one was getting arrested for any of that, and that's considerably more provocative in terms. This is projecting onto Windsor Castle is one thing, but Windsor Castle is not Parliament, right? Um, and they got away with that perfectly fine, as far as I remember. Um, But obviously, yeah, like Republic got arrested during the uh, Prince Charles coronation, and Class War. I seem to remember getting arrested during a Jubilee um, when they were trying to do a bit of anti Queen stuff. Um, and you go all the way back to the arrests that kept on being made whenever that Greek monarch during the uh, pre-Junta years, or was it during the Junta? But this kind of arresting people and then letting them go, and it kind of the suspending of our basic rights to protest and make our viewpoints known is so common, and it's a weirdly accepted bit of cultural paraphernalia, I suppose, that this happens. Um,
Yeah, you can arrest people to prevent a breach of the peace. Um, Pretty much for anything. That's for what happened with the Jubilee and the royal weddings stuff. And it's not a criminal offence. You can just stop people from starting a situation which might end up in kicking it off. So that exists. There are, if you get commercial firms projecting stuff, then you can sue them if it's detrimental to your character. You could sue them for defamation if it's giving a false. That just doesn't apply to protest groups. They haven't got the money to make it worth anyone's while. And I thought you were going to do the Donald Room story.
I sort of
Which
edged towards it, but
yeah, but a slightly different one where the cop simply planted a brick on him. And there's
the
always
Challenor
that
case, if anyone wants to look at it.
yeah, we've got quite a lot on that one available in the shop at reasonable prices. So we won't tell you now.
It's a good case, though. He beat it in a very entertaining way. Um, yeah, I mean, obviously, sort of the bit to round it off, I suppose, is just hammering home the way in which the right loves to complain vociferously about the likes of Graham Linehan, and the way in which Farage is victimised and Tommy Robinson's victimised and all the rest of it, and absolutely silent about a blatant. Like if they were being consistent about any of this, they'd be making a huge fuss. And of course they won't, because they actually quite like Donald Trump and they don't want him being besmirched. Um, so, the far right, hypocritical, who knew? Uh, all right, moving on to hypocrites. We have our third item, and it's Starmer's bad month. And he's been, poor lamb, he's been struggling to deal with the fallout from the march. He showed his first attempt at a spine in many years by actually saying the march wasn't altogether great. Well done, Keir. But prior to that, obviously, he had been making all kinds of excuses. He'd been saying, oh, well, flags up everywhere are a great patriotic symbol, and I've got them in my home, which only encouraged people to do it more, whilst doing nothing at all to improve Labour's polling. So a complete waste of time in that sense, but a great coup for the far right. And now the far right has pulled out 100,000 people and he's panicking. It would not be surprised to me at all if we started seeing more of the, maybe we should be looking again at the Human Rights Act and the European Court of Human Rights and all the rest of it, and our relationship to it, because that is always the go-to when it comes to reactionary groupings and, oh, what do you mean we can't act like complete bastards to everybody? But we'll
it,
see whether that pops up.
it is a stunningly bad week that he sacked the ambassador to the US because he was friends with a paedophile, and he's giving a state visit to a friend of a paedophile, the same paedophile who did exactly the same stuff. We've covered this so often in these little podcasts that the reason that the far right is getting traction is Labour looks so bad all the time. The loss of Angela Rayner is a big blow um, for Labour, I feel, because they have lost one of the last people who could keep the left on board, and that is an unfortunate accident. I would suggest it is always, if all politicians who were on the fiddle with their taxes were sacked, there would be a nice empty building to use as a dung store, as was suggested in a certain news from nowhere. Um, I just get the impression that she lacked the sophistication in fiddling her expenses that most MPs are brought up to have. But
Yeah,
as
I very much got the impression that it was incompetence rather than, because it was such a like fiddling your expenses in that way. It's so easy to get caught, and you're just throwing away your career. And she's
yeah,
she's been very poor at hiding her interest in becoming the next prime minister. And it's the sort of thing where, yeah, if you want to become PM, you do squeaky clean and all that kind of stuff. Of course you do. Um, but the thing which struck me about Rayner having to resign was alongside, as you say, it being fairly disastrous for Labour's appeal to its core demographic, was the way in which Starmer and co. then doubled down on hiring on board the rest of the Blue Labour mob, not even attempting to hire on any conciliatory figures, but just doing the Morgan McSweeney wish list, which I thought absolutely astonishing decision. Um, like I can't think of a better way to turn a problem into a worse disaster. Because all they've because what have they got like the only way I can see Labour pulling itself out of this hole now is that as and when Starmer goes, and I think that increasingly his position is becoming weaker and weaker, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's gone within the next year, two. Um, Certainly, the next local elections are going to put him under immense pressure. But let's assume that Starmer goes. Um, the only person who could turn the ship around is Andy Burnham. Not because Andy Burnham is a particularly strong politician in that sense. I don't think he is. I think uh, his position as king over the water is very much overstated in terms of his personal charisma. Like he's a competent mayor of Manchester. Like I've seen him speak. We saw him go up against Corbyn and get absolutely rinsed. Like people forget this. He was nowhere near. Um, but he's their best opportunity to restore a sense of someone with a vague sense of veracity behind him. But Morgan McSweeney's not going to want him. And Morgan McSweeney now holds all of the levers at the top of the Labour Party. So McSweeney, given the opportunity, and he will have that opportunity, will probably put in Wes Streeting or some similar complete vacuous suit in hock to the health companies, and more, look even worse than Keir Starmer in terms of his appeal to the general public. It seems like a hiding into. I don't see where Labour goes from here, in any positive sense. Which of course,
Yeah,
from an sorry,
no, um, if they could get an honest front man, to, the trouble is that they have so burnt the bridges with the campaign of that we will be upright public servants and not on the fiddle and keeping our promises and showing ethics in our foreign policy. That unless they did something so radical like cutting off diplomatic ties with Israel and boycotting them entirely, that there is no way that they can get anyone on the left back. And on the other hand, as we're seeing, that there is no amount of flag waving or smashing the boats is going to make them look more popular to the right than Farage's, and it just looks like a downward trail all the way. They just have to hope that the right remains split between the Tories and Reform, to give them any chance of getting a decent showing in the next election.
and that that your party is a complete flop, which there is every chance it will be. I like the signs so far have tended towards um, like it's difficult to say whether it's going to all end in tears, but it does seem to have gotten off to a rocky start. It seems to have all of the factional um, politicking and infighting already before it's even got going. I strongly get the impression that the central grouping are struggling to pull together both logistically and in terms of personalities. Um, but if your party does get its act together, it has every opportunity to rob the entire vote from Labour's heartlands. And Labour's got to sit there and hope. It's a really weird position, in one which I think we've done quite well in predicting from quite early on, and actually before Starmer's premiership as well, that this was going to happen. But it's to such a depth so early on that I think even from our cynical perspectives, it's been quite shockingly like, wow, Labour's going to have to rely entirely on both the far right and everyone and the entire grouping to its left being completely incompetent if it wants to come anywhere close to salvaging any of its seats come the next election. An absolutely bizarre situation for it to find itself in at this stage in the electoral cycle. Opportunities for anarchists.
Yay! Should we have a book fair to plan it?
Yeah. Um, Perfect segue. Well done. We have an anarchist book fair coming up this Saturday from 10 a.m. at the Waterloo Tunnels, which are a 4-minute walk. You can check the Anarchist Book Fair, London Anarchist Bookfair Instagram. It has all of the details. And indeed, the Freedom website has all of the workshops listed, and there's a handful of really good ones. So there's Kay Tempest, a fantastic poet, author, and performer, is going to be on the stage. There's going to be Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, who, for folks who don't know, legendary Black Panther and Black anarchist, long-time political prisoner, fascinating speaker, well worth going to listen to. He'll be talking about Black anarchism, the importance of it, the history of Black resistance, particularly in the US, obviously, where he's from. And Peter Geldloos, who most people will know from his many works, including the extremely relevant Non-Violence Protects the State, an entire topic we have not touched on, but probably highly relevant to various things that we've been talking about tonight. But there's a bunch of really interesting workshops as well. You've got Learning from Capitalism's Past and Confronting Future Challenges from the Old Moles Collective. There's veganarchy, I can never pronounce that properly, vegan anarchism, as you might imagine, global ecology and global economy, decriminalization of sex work, solidarity economy as a strategy, and this is the building the collective power to overcome and survive capitalism within the capitalist framework. It's obviously a reformist tactic, but one which as anarchists, I think it's fair to say that we all engage with to one degree or another. Most of us engage with things like workers' co-ops and various forms of mutual aid. And indeed, freedom itself is a workers' co-op which has to make a crust. So, our revolutionary ideals aside, how we survive and interact within capitalism is an important topic. Just as aside, there is radical singing for the Red and Black Song Club, which you can join in with and find out a bit about the history of radical music. How to start a union. There's always a how to start a union. We do like our unions. From the Draft Workers Union, which is an interesting one that was based on a games pub, which unionised with the EVW, I seem to remember, and made quite a splash a few years ago. And then there's obviously discussion about the Palestine and Sudan genocides, anti-raids and migrant solidarity, and fighting for our right to the city, which is a panel of some really interesting campaigns. The Aylesbury campaign, Lesnes occupation, housing action, Southwark and Lambeth, and the London Renters Union, all of whom have really useful things to say wherever you come from. But Andy, the London Anarchist Book Fair over the last few years obviously has been something of a different beast necessarily. It's a new collective from the Anarchist Book Fair that ended in 2017. What have your thoughts been on the last few, which took place at Rich Mix, but also at Freedom and at various and at Whitechapel Art Gallery in that kind of Brick Lane area, which sadly we are no longer, sadly from a Freedom perspective, because we made a lot of money from being right down the road from the Oak Fair on the Saturday. Um, but
Yes,
what? Sorry.
it's um obviously for people who don't know, I used to work at Freedom, and particularly in the bookshop. So having the book fair local to the bookshop was a great logistical boon. Queen Mary's for many years was extremely uh, good for us, and yeah, we've been in a variety of places over the years, and I must say that the recent set of ones, particularly with multiple venues, has actually been quite good. It's been pretty good to get into the East End and have people wandering around as you were getting between Lark, Freedom, and up Brick Lane, where actually we were interacting with local people in a way that some of the bigger venues you just piled in and sat there for the duration of the event. So I think I first went in '87 when we were at Conway Hall, where it stayed until the '90s, and it just grew beyond the capacity. Though we were back there very briefly in 19, I think. The years sometimes skip by, but it's a great institution. But what we have not had, from my memory, for 20 years is the good old book fair fight, of which the coronet in uh, Holloway Road was the biggest and bestest of which, despite us getting the spoons closed by the police, we were doing relatively well. If only there hadn't been an Arsenal home game
God, I
with the
remember
whole
that.
of the TSG parked up for the whole afternoon, uh, and suddenly 12 rounds of them appeared and beat the crap out of everyone. It's very unfortunate. But
I remember
everyone's
being at
take take
I remember
take
being at the
great
front
care to
door.
not to.
Sorry. And there you
Mm. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so everyone should be very, very careful just in case the police fancy a bit of overtime and decide to provoke anything. So always keep your bus card handy. Uh, Green and Black Cross, ACAB, we will have a stall where, and if people do have legal problems, please come along and ask us, and as well as the usual channels of phoning the protest support line, you actually get to see some of it in the face, and talk about whatever legal things may come up. So that's my little plug. But I suppose we should do a big plug for um, the bookstore, which Freedom will doubtless be doing.
we will.
Um,
We don't have, unfortunately, because um, so the same reason that it's at Waterloo is that it's earlier this year than usual. So September the 20th. Usually it would be around October the 20th instead. Um, and this was because they lost the Rich Mix venue and were then very kindly offered Waterloo Tunnel, but they could only have it in September. The problem with that for us, obviously, is that we time, generally speaking, our books to come out for an October book fair, and have been somewhat wrong-footed by it being a month early. So our paper won't be coming out till October, and our books, we may put the one that we had in mind, which is the Greek crisis. It's basically a book about the Greek economic crisis, and for people who don't know, the 2008 to 2015-ish period, 2016, was one of tremendous upheaval in Greece, and the anarchists were front and center of it, due to a combination of wild corruption, poor economic positioning when the 2008 financial crisis hit, um, Germany then attempting to bully its way into making a shed load of money by imposing onerous conditions on Greece, and the anarchist movement there being already fairly well organized and very active, both in um, numerical terms and in blowing stuff up and burning things down. Famously, they burnt down the Christmas tree in Sintakama Square in the centre of Athens. One of the most spectacular images of that of those years. Um, but yeah, so we're in the middle of producing that as a book, but we may put that off until kind of November and have it as a Christmas one now. The journal won't be coming out until October, so we're just keeping our schedule. What we are doing instead is we're doing a 4-page supplement to go with the summer issue, which we'll either do as an insert or if people want to read it. That is going to include a little bit on the uh, reduction of civil liberties, which have been imposed by both Tory governments and more recently, obviously, by Labour itself. And then a lot of details about things like who do you go to if you were in legal trouble, GBC obviously being one of the major ones, and housing groups which you can look into, like Radical Roots, and where there are housing co-ops, and where anarchist-friendly spaces are. Because obviously one of the things that we are particularly freedom as a bricks and mortar place, we tend to think that you build movements through those kinds of front-facing environments in which you interact with the public and you give people an opportunity to just walk in and talk about politics with you. So yes, that's hopefully worth looking out for. As I understand it, AK Press, PM Press, Active Distribution may have a presence. I'm not 100% sure. The usual suspects are all going to be there, and they will be itching for people to come and talk to them about anarchism. We love that. I think that is most of what we had on the list. There is one other topic, so we kind of sidelined on it, and I hadn't really listed it, but probably worth talking through a little bit. Is Charlie Kirk and the killing of Charlie Kirk, and partly I think because the right's reaction to it is worth talking about in terms of it fairly terrifying, with the US government just flat out saying we're going to start getting people fired if they were not pro political assassinations, but saying Charlie Kirk was a dickhead, which pre-Charlie Kirk dying was not a controversial thing to say, particularly. Certainly not something that could get you suspended or fired, which has happened in the US as a result of this kind of language. Obviously, there's been wild dehumanization going on in which the left are killers and the left are violent, has been a recurring phrase. Christians have been talking about the left as demonic and demons, which is the sort of language which does lead to killing people because you no longer think of them as human. But also the left itself, which I think broad swathes of the left made a bit of a boo-boo in just leaping on this idea that, oh, violence couldn't possibly be coming from the left. He must be a groyper, which, for people who don't know, is a supporter of a guy called Nick Fuentes, who had a beef with Charlie Kirk because he felt that Charlie Kirk was not racist or transphobic or fascist enough. Which there was some evidence which you could pass as being, oh, well, this guy might be a right winger, particularly writing on the casings of the bullets, which were quite online and Reddity and linked to gaming culture, and some which apparently are memed by Fuentes and co, but also are just things which could be said by an anti-fascist, like Bella Ciao and catch this fascist, right? Like an anti-fascist were doing that kind of thing in theory. Yeah, I would see them writing that. So I think people jump the gun and it's done no end of harm in the sense that it's much easier if you say, look, the left has got a long and, in many, from many perspectives, quite glorious history of physically fighting back against oppressive forces in the US and elsewhere. You know, like I was watching a movie, Matawan, the other day, in which miners shot a bunch of Pinkertons, and we've been celebrating that sort of thing for the best part of a century. Um, if you present the left as incapable of being violent or producing violent people or people going off on one with or without popular support to be violent, and then it turns out the other way, you look like a fool and you look like a liar. It fully endorses the right wing's view that the left lies and makes stuff up and refuses to acknowledge the things that it is. Um, whereas, even if you are saying specifically, I don't agree with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, there should be an acknowledgement that, yeah, of course, the left has a history and, in fact, has a recent history of celebrating the shooting of, for example, a farmer CEO. Like that stuff does happen. And you have to acknowledge that it happens before you start in on, yeah, but actually the right is more violent, more habitually so. And if you look at the response to the shooting of Charlie Kirk, it has been horrifying from the right. Um, and actually, most of the left haven't endorsed the killing of Charlie Kirk. And you can, I, from a personal perspective, I don't think it helps all that much generally if you get into the whole, yeah, this guy died, fuck his wife and kid. I mean, his wife doesn't seem like a great person either, but like it doesn't really present you as in a particularly great light. But it's also true that Charlie Kirk almost certainly killed more people through his rhetoric in aggregate, through the ways in which he changed policy, the ways in which he encouraged people who are violent. Charlie Kirk himself didn't actively say people should be hurt, but he gave all of the excuses for people who do feel that way to act on it. Um, like, if you want to talk about stochastic killings, Charlie Kirk was almost certainly responsible for more than a few himself. And I don't think that it's unreasonable for people to say him being removed from his position, albeit in a way which was very unfortunate and maybe not to be applauded, but it probably saved lives. And I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to make that argument, and certainly to say that the guy was a scumbag, because he was. That's just flat out what he was.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the anarchists. Uh, we went through this propaganda by the deed period in the late 1930s, 20th century, and that's why anarchism is always associated with assassinations and with throwing bombs, etc., etc. And the problem that anarchism found is that that was not resonating with the working class, and it was not achieving the objectives that we wanted. And I'm certainly not sorry that he's dead. I just don't think that assassination is a successful political path, and I'm rather for all the Lord of the Rings fans with Gandalf on this one. That many that live deserve death, and some that die actually deserve to live. Can you give it to them? Therefore, you shouldn't be too eager to deal out death in judgment. What we're dealing with is social change, and sometimes that requires use of force. To, as I think the other key thing that you pointed out is another lovely '60s phrase: the violence is inherent in the system. There is no political system that's non-violent. Every time people talk about the use of violence, what they're actually talking about is use of force, and use of force is necessary because otherwise poor people would just go into the Ritz to eat every day if there wasn't some policemen to stop them doing it. It is a complete fib and a con to try to portray the fact that society as it is does not rest on a massive use of violence, both at the individual level and, as we are seeing internationally, that where millions are starving and being killed around the world by violence. And you uh, um, it is ironic that anarchism will always be associated with the bomb carrying hoodlum, when, as bless him, Donald Room had a wonderful cartoon that said, well, the anarchists didn't invent the atom bomb. We haven't got any bombs, and then you've got enough bombs amongst the capitalists and the state communists to destroy the planet 10 times over.
Yeah. And, it's also, I think it was very telling that so many people started on the right started calling for the death penalty without a hint of irony when he was arrested. There is a strong there was a really interesting little poll or study or whatever it was that was doing the rounds on social media, which suggested that the right, uh, when asked the question, "Do you think political violence is justified?" was more against political violence than the left, and particularly the far left. But when I read that question, what I was thinking was, of course they are, because the monopoly of violence is the state. From their perspective, political violence only refers to extra extra state, extra parliamentary violence, which is not endorsed by forces they feel comfortable with. But they're 100%. If you ask any of them, oh, would the police be justified in tasing someone to make sure that they're complying with orders? They'd all say yes. And that's violence on behalf, that's political violence, because it's in the service of a political outcome. The protection of state, of property, protection of stability of the state, right? Like all of these things, there's no, there's unless you are talking about someone committing violence on a totally random basis, perhaps they're going through something or having a serious mental health issue or whatever. Violence is almost always in some way political. Um, but yeah,
Yes, I mean, and
it's
I suppose to link that to the book fair, and a reassurance that violence can be driven by people's personal needs. But one of the things that we won't have at this book fair that we did once at Conway Hall, because there's no balconies, no one will be able to piss on the stalls from above, as once happened. Because they're obviously in great need of relieving themselves, and a walk to the loo was beyond their abilities.
we just don't get the cross punk mayhem we used to. um,
Tragically, no.
so on which note, thank you. We've pretty much dead on hit our hour, so that's very satisfying. Thank you very much, Andy, for as ever, interesting little background stories and thoughts. And yeah, hopefully we will see you all next week. Cheerio, and have a good time at the book fair. Bye.